Captain Jake Morrison stared at the radar screen on Aegis Prime Station and could not believe what he was seeing. 12 massive ships had appeared at the edge of Earth's solar system without any warning. The ships looked like nothing humanity had ever built. They were long and smooth with crystal surfaces that caught the light from the sun and threw it back in strange colors. Each ship was at least 10 miles long and moved through space like swimming fish instead of flying machines. Jake pressed the red alert button and spoke into his radio. Admiral Lisa Kane on Mars base answered quickly. Her voice was calm, but Jake could hear worry under the words. The 12 alien ships were moving toward Earth, and they were not responding to any messages from human controllers. Every attempt to talk to them failed. The ships just kept coming closer and closer to the blue planet that 8 billion humans called home. Dr. Sam Rodriguez was working in his lab when the emergency alarm started ringing. He ran to the communication center where dozens of people were trying to figure out what was happening. The alien ships had stopped just outside Earth's atmosphere and were now sending a message. The message came in perfect English, which surprised everyone. How did these aliens know human language? The message was simple and terrible. A voice that sounded like wind blowing through metal pipes spoke from the communication system. The voice said it belonged to High Commander Vextala of the Zephyrian hegemony. The aliens were giving humanity 72 hours to leave Earth completely. They wanted the planet for themselves, and they said humans were too primitive to deserve such a beautiful world. If humans did not leave, the Zephyrians would take the planet by force. Admiral Kane called an emergency meeting with all the leaders of Earth. They met through video screens since there was no time to travel. The President of North America, the Premier of the Asian Union, and leaders from every continent joined the call. They all agreed on one thing. Earth was humanity's home, and they would not give it up without a fight. They had built cities and farms and families on this world for thousands of years. No alien army would take that away. The human fleet was small compared to the Zephyrian ships. Earth had only 15 warships, and they were built for fighting other humans, not advanced aliens. But Admiral Kane ordered every ship to prepare for battle. She also started the emergency evacuation plan that had been made years before in case of asteroid impact or nuclear war. Transport ships would carry as many people as possible to the colonies on Mars and the outer planets. Jake Morrison watched the Zephyrian ships from his station high above Earth. The alien vessels were beautiful in a cold way, but he knew they carried death inside their crystal hulls. He thought about his sister Katie, who lived in New York with her family. He thought about all the people down on the planet who were looking up at the sky and wondering if they would live to see another sunrise. The 72 hours passed like a bad dream. Millions of people crowded into transport ships while millions more waited for rescue that would never come. The evacuation ships could only carry a small part of Earth's population. Most people would have to stay behind and hope that somehow the human fleet could win an impossible battle. When the deadline ended, High Commander Vextala sent another message. She said humans were foolish to resist, and now they would pay the price for their stubbornness. The 12 Zephyrian ships moved into position around Earth like hunters surrounding their prey. Jake could see weapons forming on the crystal hulls. Weapons that glowed with power he could not understand. The attack began without warning. Beams of pure energy shot down from the alien ships and struck the surface of Earth. Where the beams hit, the ground melted like butter under a hot knife. Cities disappeared in seconds as the heat turned buildings into glass and steel into vapor. The oceans began to boil and steam rose into the atmosphere like fog. Jake watched his home planet die. The human fleet tried to fight back, but their weapons barely scratched the alien ships. One by one, the human warships were destroyed by the same energy beams that were killing Earth. Admiral Kane's flagship lasted the longest, but even it finally exploded in a ball of fire and metal. In the final hours, Jake received one last transmission. From Earth, it came from a bunker deep under New York where his sister Katie had taken shelter with other survivors. Her voice was weak but clear as she spoke into her radio. She said the city was melting around them and the bunker was getting very hot. She told Jake to remember everyone who died and to make the aliens pay for what they had done. The transmission ended in static as New York became a pool of molten rock. Jake sat in his chair and cried as Earth turned from a blue and green world into a red ball of fire. The Zephyrians had taken humanity's home and turned it into hell. Now the survivors had to decide what to do next. 5 years had passed since the Zephyrians turned Earth into a burning rock. The survivors now lived scattered across the solar system like seeds blown by a terrible wind. Mars held the largest group with 300 million people crowded into domed cities that had been built for much smaller populations. Europa and Titan had smaller colonies where people worked in factories and farms under artificial skies. The asteroid belt was full of mining stations where desperate humans dug for metals and water to keep their new homes running. General Marcus Cole lived on Ceres Station, where he spent his days planning something that most people thought was impossible. He wanted to build a fleet strong enough to fight the Zephyrians and take back what they had stolen. Marcus had been a young officer when Earth died, and the memory of that day burned in his mind like acid. He worked 18 hours every day, organizing supplies and recruiting volunteers for his secret project, the Terran Liberation. Fleet was hidden inside asteroid mining operations throughout the belt. To anyone watching from the outside, the asteroids looked like normal mining sites where workers dug up iron and ice. But inside the hollowed-out rocks, humans were building warships using plans that mixed human engineering with alien technology. They had salvaged from the battle 5 years ago. Betty Chun was the engineer who made the new technology possible. She had studied the wreckage of Zephyrian ships that crashed on Mars during the final battle. The alien technology was far ahead of anything humans had built, but Betty was smart enough to figure out how it worked. She learned how to make energy shields and plasma cannons and engines that could move ships faster than light. The new human ships would be small and fast instead of big and slow like the old fleet. Commander Alex Stone led the reconnaissance missions that mapped Zephyrian space. His job was the most dangerous because he had to fly deep into alien territory without being caught. Alex used stolen Zephyrian ships to blend in with enemy traffic while he counted their forces and studied their bases. He discovered that the Zephyrian Empire controlled 12 star systems with hundreds of worlds full of conquered species. The most important thing Alex learned was that the Zephyrians were not as strong as they seemed. Their empire was run from their homeworld called Zephyr Prime, and every major decision had to be approved by the high command there. If a Zephyrian colony lost contact with the homeworld, the local commanders became confused and unable to act quickly. This gave the humans an idea for how to fight an enemy that was much bigger than they were. Dr. Nina Foster worked in a secret laboratory on Titan, where she studied captured Zephyrian computer files. She discovered that the aliens were not the original owners of their empire. They had been refugees from another galaxy who arrived in this region of space 300 years ago. Their first homeworld had been destroyed by some disaster they never talked about. Since then, they had built their empire by conquering weaker species and taking their planets. Nina also learned that the Zephyrians used slave labor to run most of their empire. Dozens of alien species worked in their factories and farms and mines, while Zephyrian overseers watched them with energy whips. The slaves were kept under control by computer chips planted in their brains that caused terrible pain if they tried to rebel. But Nina thought she might be able to find a way to disable those chips if humans could get close enough to the slave worlds. President Ryan Clark had been elected by the survivors to lead humanity through its darkest time. He lived in the new capital city of New Geneva on Mars, where he met with leaders from all the human colonies. Ryan knew that his people wanted revenge against the Zephyrians, but he also knew they were too weak to win a direct fight. The alien empire had thousands of ships, while humanity had managed to build only 50 vessels in 5 years of secret work, but Ryan had a plan that was bigger than just taking back Earth. He wanted to destroy the entire Zephyrian empire and free all the slave species they had conquered. If humans could unite the slaves and turn them into allies, they might have enough strength to win. It would be the biggest war the galaxy had ever seen, and humanity would be fighting for the freedom of billions of creatures. They had never met. Jake Morrison now commanded one of the new human ships called the Revenge. It was smaller than the old warships, but much faster and harder to detect. Jake and his crew spent months training for the mission that would begin their war against the Zephyrians. They practiced attack runs and escape routes until they could fly their ship with their eyes closed. The plan was to start with small attacks on Zephyrian outposts while spreading messages to the slave species about human intentions to help them. If everything went right, the small attacks would grow into rebellions that would spread across the Empire like fire through dry grass. If the plan failed, humanity would probably be wiped out completely, and the survivors would spend their last days running from Zephyrian hunters. Katie Bell's final message played in every human colony as a reminder of what they were fighting for. Her words about making the aliens pay had become the motto of the Liberation Fleet. Every ship carried her picture, and every soldier wore a patch with her name. She had become the symbol of human determination to never give up no matter how hopeless things seemed. Marcus Cole stood in the command center of his secret base and looked at the display, showing 50 human warships ready for battle. It was not much compared to the thousands of Zephyrian vessels, but it was a start. The first strike would happen soon, and then humanity would find out if their long years of preparation had been enough to begin the fight for their freedom. Kepler Station hung in space like a giant metal flower with dozens of arms reaching out from its central hub. The Zephyrian military base controlled 3 star systems and housed 50,000 alien soldiers. It had never been attacked in the 200 years since it was built. The Zephyrians thought it was safe behind its powerful shields and surrounded by patrol ships that could detect any enemy approaching. Captain Diana Ross commanded the human battleship Vengeance as it dropped out of hyperspace just outside the Kepler system. Behind her came 49 other human ships arranged in attack formation. They had practiced this moment for months, but Diana still felt her heart beating fast as she gave the order to begin the assault. This was humanity's first real strike against the Zephyrian Empire, and everything depended on surprise. The human ships moved toward Kepler Station using a new technology that Betty Chun had developed from studying alien computer systems. The stealth generators made the human vessels nearly invisible to Zephyrian sensors by copying the energy patterns of space dust and cosmic radiation. To the aliens watching their screens, it looked like a small meteor shower was drifting toward their station. Lieutenant Tony Garcia flew one of the new human fighters in the first wave of the attack. His ship was tiny compared to the massive Zephyrian vessels, but it carried quantum disruptor weapons that could tear through alien shields like paper through rain. Tony had lost his parents when Earth burned, and he wanted to make the Zephyrians pay for every human life they had taken. The attack began when the human fighters suddenly appeared on Zephyrian sensors like ghosts becoming solid. Before the aliens could react, Tony and his squadron fired their disruptors at the station's shield generators. The quantum weapons sent waves of energy that made the alien shields collapse like soap bubbles popping. For the first time in centuries, Kepler Station was defenseless. Diana brought the Vengeance in close and open fire with every weapon the ship carried. Plasma cannons and missile launchers filled space with deadly light as they hammered the station's hull. The Zephyrian base shook under the assault, and pieces of metal flew off into the void. Emergency alarms screamed through the corridors as alien soldiers ran to their battle stations. The Zephyrian patrol ships tried to respond, but they were confused by the sudden appearance of human vessels. Their commanders had never fought humans before and did not know what to expect. The aliens were used to fighting enemies who used their own tactics and weapons. But humans fought differently, using speed and unpredictable movements that made them hard to target. Commander Vexcall led the Zephyrian defense from the station's command center. He had served the Empire for 60 years and had conquered a dozen worlds for the hegemony. But he had never seen anything like the human attack. The enemy ships moved in patterns that made no sense according to Zephyrian military doctrine. They should have formed orderly battle lines and traded shots at long range like civilized warriors. Instead, they darted around like angry insects. Striking from unexpected angles, the battle turned when human boarding parties landed on the station using small craft that could slip through the broken shields. The humans fought their way through the corridors using weapons designed specifically to hurt Zephyrians. Sonic disruptors made the aliens dizzy and confused while electromagnetic pulse grenades shut down their equipment. The Zephyrians had superior numbers, but the humans had spent 5 years studying their enemies and learning their weaknesses. In the deepest part of the station, the humans found something they had not expected. Thousands of alien prisoners were locked in cells, members of conquered species who had been enslaved by the Zephyrians. There were reptilian creatures called Geconians with green scales and bright yellow eyes. There were gas-breathing beings called Nebulans who floated in special atmosphere tanks. All of them had been captured when their homeworlds fell to Zephyrian forces. Chief Science Officer Rick Bell led the team that freed the prisoners. Rick was Katie Bell's older brother, and he had joined the Liberation Fleet to honor his sister's memory. He used translation devices to communicate with the freed slaves and learned that many of them had been waiting for years for someone to rescue them. The Geconians and Nebulans had valuable information about Zephyrian military tactics and the locations of other slave populations. The freed aliens told Rick about the control chips that all slaves had planted in their brains. The chips caused terrible pain if the slaves tried to fight back or escape, but Dr. Nina Foster had sent instructions for disabling the chips, and Rick's team was able to free the prisoners from their electronic chains. For the first time in years, the slaves could think and act without fear of punishment. When the battle ended, Kepler Station was under human control and Commander Vexcall was dead. The Zephyrian patrol ships had been destroyed or captured and 3,000 alien soldiers were prisoners. But more importantly, humanity had gained 5,000 new allies who knew the secrets of the Zephyrian Empire. The news of the victory spread through space faster than light as human ships carried the message to every corner of the galaxy. The Zephyrians were not invincible. They could be beaten by an enemy who was smart enough and brave enough to fight them. On 3 Zephyrian colony worlds, slave populations heard the news and began planning rebellions of their own. High Commander Vextala received the report of Kepler Station's fall while she was meeting with the Supreme Council on Zephyr Prime. The other commanders demanded to know how primitive humans had managed to defeat a major military base. Vextala had no good answer. The humans had appeared from nowhere with technology that should not exist and tactics that made no sense. Diana Ross stood on the bridge of the Vengeance and looked at the captured station through the main viewing screen. The battle was won, but she knew it was only the beginning. The Zephyrians would respond with massive force and try to crush the human rebellion before it could spread. But humanity was no longer alone in the fight. They had allies now and the promise of more to come. Rick Bell sent a message to Mars Base, reporting the successful capture of Kepler Station and the liberation of 5,000 slaves. He included detailed information about Zephyrian weaknesses and the locations of other prison facilities. The war for galactic freedom had begun, and humanity had fired the first shot that would echo across the stars. The victory at Kepler Station had sent shock waves through the Zephyrian Empire like cracks spreading through broken glass. Within weeks of the battle, 3 slave worlds had risen up against their alien masters. The rebellions were small at first, but they grew stronger as word spread that the mighty Zephyrians could be defeated. Admiral Steve Parker coordinated the growing rebel fleet from his flagship Retribution as humanity found itself leading a galactic war of liberation on Proxima Centauri b. Major Amy Foster commanded 2,000 human marines as they dropped from orbit to help a Geconian uprising. The reptilian aliens had been enslaved for over a century, but they still remembered how to fight. Their green scales were tough enough to stop small weapons, and their yellow eyes could see in the dark tunnels where Zephyrian overseers had built their control centers. Amy's job was to capture the main computer that controlled the slave chips and free 2 million Geconians from electronic bondage. The assault on the Geconian prison camps was brutal and quick. Human soldiers used plasma rifles to blast through the walls, while Geconian rebels attacked from inside using improvised weapons made from mining tools. The Zephyrian guards were caught between two forces and could not defend themselves effectively. Within 6 hours, the entire planet was free and the Gekonians were dancing in their streets for the first time in generations. Dr. Helen Price worked with freed Gekonian scientists to study their biology and learn how their bodies worked. The reptilian aliens had natural resistance to many types of radiation, and their scales could absorb certain kinds of energy. Helen used this knowledge to develop new medical treatments that made human soldiers nearly immune to Zephyrian sonic weapons. The alliance between humans and aliens was making both sides stronger. Meanwhile, Colonel Chris Murphy was leading the siege of Tau Ceti, where the Zephyrians had enslaved an entire ocean world full of aquatic beings called Hydronians. The water planet was covered by one continuous sea that was 3 miles deep in most places. The Hydronians lived in underwater cities made from coral and metal, while their Zephyrian masters controlled them from floating platforms on the surface. The siege lasted 3 weeks as human ships fought Zephyrian naval forces above the waves, while Hydronic rebels attacked from below. The aquatic aliens could swim faster than any spacecraft could fly underwater, and they knew every current and trench in their home ocean. They guided human submarines to weak points in Zephyrian defenses and showed them how to use the planet's tides as weapons. When Tau Ceti finally fell, the grateful Hydronians offered their entire fleet to the liberation cause. The Hydronic ships were designed for underwater combat, but they worked just as well in space. Their hulls were built to withstand crushing ocean pressure, so they were nearly indestructible in battle. Admiral Parker suddenly found his fleet doubled in size as thousands of aquatic vessels joined the human armada, but the Zephyrians were not going to give up their empire without a fight. High Commander Vextella decided that if she could not stop the rebellions, she would make them so costly that other slaves would be afraid to rise up. She authorized the use of planet-killer weapons that had been banned for centuries, even by Zephyrian standards. The first target was New Harmony, a human colony world that had been built by refugees after Earth's destruction. The attack on New Harmony came without warning as a single Zephyrian ship dropped out of hyperspace and fired a gravity bomb at the planet's core. The weapon tore the world apart from the inside as its gravity field went wild and pulled chunks of rock and metal into a crushing sphere. 3 million humans died in seconds as their new home became a cloud of debris floating in space. News of the atrocity reached the Liberation Fleet just as they were celebrating another victory. Admiral Parker read the report with tears in his eyes as he realized that the war had entered a new and darker phase. Zephyrians were willing to commit genocide to keep their empire, and they would kill billions of innocents if they had to. But the massacre of New Harmony only made the rebels more determined to fight. Commander Kate Lewis ran the intelligence network that gathered information about Zephyrian plans and movements. She used captured alien equipment to break their communication codes and listen to their secret messages. Kate discovered that the aliens were planning something called the Final Cleansing, a systematic extermination of all freed worlds and their populations. The Zephyrians intended to kill every rebel and every freed slave to make sure the uprising could never happen again. Agent Frank Moore led spy teams deep into Zephyrian space to confirm Kate's intelligence reports. Frank and his people risked their lives to plant listening devices on alien ships and steal computer files from enemy bases. The information they gathered painted a terrifying picture of what the Zephyrians were planning. The alien empire was massing its entire fleet at their homeworld of Zephyr Prime for one final campaign to end the rebellion permanently. The liberated species were horrified when they learned about the Final Cleansing, but they were not surprised. The Zephyrians had used similar tactics before to crush rebellions on other worlds. The aliens believed that total destruction was the only way to maintain control over their vast empire. They would rather rule over empty planets than lose any part of their territory to freed slaves. President Ryan Clark called an emergency meeting of all rebel leaders to discuss their response to the Zephyrian threat. Representatives from dozens of species gathered on the liberated world of Kepler Prime to plan their strategy. The meeting was held in the same conference room where Zephyrian commanders had once planned the conquest of innocent worlds. Now their former slaves were using it to plan the aliens' destruction. The decision was unanimous even though everyone knew how dangerous it would be. The Liberation Forces would attack Zephyr Prime before the aliens could launch their genocidal campaign. It would be the largest space battle in galactic history, with the future of billions of lives hanging in the balance. If the rebels won, the Zephyrian Empire would fall and freedom would spread across the galaxy. If they lost, every freed world would be destroyed and their people would be wiped from existence. Admiral Parker began gathering every ship that could fight as the Liberation Fleet prepared for its final mission. Human vessels worked alongside Geckonian cruisers and hydronic submarines while dozens of other alien ships joined the armada. Engineers from every species worked together to upgrade weapons and improve defenses. The fleet that had started as 50 desperate human ships had grown into an army of thousands, ready to challenge the mightiest empire in the galaxy. The rebels knew they were facing impossible odds, but they also knew they had no choice. The Zephyrians had made it clear that there could be no peace between them and the freed slaves. One side would survive and the other would be destroyed. The Liberation Fleet set course for Zephyr Prime, carrying the hopes and dreams of every species that had ever suffered under alien rule. The combined Liberation Fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Zephyr system like a storm front moving across the sky. 8,000 ships from dozens of species formed the largest armada in galactic history as they faced the crystal spires and orbital platforms that protected the Zephyrian homeworld. Admiral Marcus Cole commanded the attack from the super dreadnought Earthfall, a massive vessel built with resources from every liberated world and armed with weapons. Designed by the galaxy's greatest minds working together, Zephyr Prime glowed like a jewel in the darkness, its surface covered with crystal cities that reached toward the stars. The planet was beautiful, but it was also the heart of an empire built on conquest and slavery. Billions of Zephyrians lived in those shining towers while their military commanders planned the deaths of entire species. The Liberation Fleet had come to end that evil forever and free the galaxy from Zephyrian rule. The defenses around Zephyr Prime were unlike anything the rebels had ever seen. Hundreds of orbital stations bristled with energy weapons, while shield generators created barriers that could stop entire fleets. Automated defense platforms moved through space like metal sharks, hunting for any ship that came too close to their homeworld. The Zephyrians had spent centuries building these defenses, and they believed nothing could break through. Commander Vexdala watched the approaching rebel fleet from her command center in the central spire, the tallest building on Zephyr Prime. She had every ship in the Zephyrian Empire waiting to defend their homeworld. 3,000 crystal vessels hung in space like a cloud of deadly stars, while ground-based weapons charged their energy cores. The rebels were brave, but they were flying into a trap that would destroy them all. Captain Luke Barnes led the first wave of fighters as they streaked toward the orbital defense platforms. His squadron included pilots from every species in the Liberation Fleet, flying ships that mixed human technology with alien innovations. Luke's own fighter carried quantum torpedoes developed by Geckonian scientists and shield generators designed by hydronic engineers. The galaxy's greatest weapons were about to be tested against its strongest defenses. The battle began when Luke's fighters launched their torpedoes at the nearest orbital station. The quantum weapons tore through space faster than light and struck the platform before its defenders could react. The explosion was visible from the surface of Zephyr Prime as metal and crystal debris scattered across the starfield. But there were hundreds more platforms, and each one was heavily armed. Commander Grace Miller coordinated the bombing runs on surface installations as human pilots dove through the planet's atmosphere like falling meteors. The Zephyrian cities were protected by energy domes that could stop most weapons, but Grace's bombers carried gravitational pulse bombs that could crush the shields from the inside. The crystal spires began to crack and fall as the rebel assault reached the planet's surface. The space battle was like nothing the galaxy had ever seen before. Thousands of ships traded fire across millions of miles, while fighters and bombers wove between the larger vessels like insects around giants. The Zephyrian crystal ships were powerful, but they were designed to fight enemies who used their own tactics. The Liberation fleet fought with desperation and creativity that confused the alien commanders. Admiral Cole brought Earthfall into the thick of the battle as the Super Dreadnought's main weapon charged for its first shot. The Vengeance cannon had been built specifically to penetrate Zephyrian planetary shields using a combination of quantum disruption and gravitational collapse. If it worked, the rebels could land troops on the surface. If it failed, the Liberation fleet would be trapped in orbit while the planet's defenses picked them apart. The cannon fired with a sound like reality tearing apart. A beam of pure destruction lanced down toward Zephyr Prime and struck the planetary shield generator with the power of a small star. The shield flickered and sparked as exotic energies fought against each other in a display that lit up half the solar system. For a moment it seemed like the defenses would hold, but then the shield collapsed and Zephyr Prime lay open to invasion. General Eddie Clark led the largest ground invasion in galactic history as landing craft filled with soldiers from every liberated species descended on the Zephyrian capital. The humans fought alongside Gekonian warriors and Hydronic marines, while dozens of other alien troops added their strength to the assault. They had to fight through city-sized fortress complexes, where every building was a weapon and every street was a killing field. The urban warfare was brutal as rebels fought from building to building toward the central spire, where High Commander Vextala directed the defense. Zephyrian soldiers used sonic weapons that could shatter bones and energy whips that cut through armor like paper. But the Liberation forces had spent years studying their enemies and developing countermeasures for every Zephyrian weapon. Dr. Sam Rodriguez activated his greatest creation as the battle raged around the central spire. The computer virus he had designed was based on captured Zephyrian communication protocols, and it spread through their network like fire through dry grass. The virus began shutting down critical systems across the planet as defense grids went offline and command centers lost contact with their forces. The turning point came when the virus reached the orbital defense platforms and began affecting their targeting systems. The automated weapons that had been precisely coordinated suddenly started firing randomly or not at all. Several platforms collided with each other as their guidance systems failed. The mighty Zephyrian defense network was being destroyed from within by its own technology. High Commander Vextala realized that her empire was doomed as rebel forces fought their way up the central spire toward her command center. She had one final weapon that could still turn the tide of battle. Hidden deep beneath Zephyr Prime was a doomsday device that could destroy the entire solar system along with everyone in it. If she could not save her empire, she would make sure the rebels died with it. Commander Alex Stone had been monitoring Zephyrian communications when he detected the activation sequence for the doomsday weapon. He realized what Vexthala was planning and knew that millions of liberation fighters would die unless someone stopped her. Alex left his post and fought his way through the burning city toward the weapons control center in the deepest part of the central spire. The final confrontation took place in a chamber carved from living crystal where the doomsday device hummed with enough power to crack planets. Vexthala stood before the activation controls with her hand reaching for the final switch. Alex burst into the room just as she was about to trigger the weapon. They fought with energy blades among the crystal formations while the device counted down toward galactic destruction. Alex managed to destroy the activation controls, but Vextala's blade found his heart before he could escape. He died knowing that he had saved the Liberation fleet and ensured victory for the forces of freedom. His sacrifice became legend among the liberated species as the story spread of the human who gave his life to prevent genocide. With their command structure collapsed and their weapons offline, the remaining Zephyrian forces surrendered as their crystal cities burned around them. The mighty empire that had ruled the galaxy for centuries was broken and its capital world lay in ruins. The age of Zephyrian dominance was over and a new era of freedom was about to begin. 6 months after the fall of Zephyr Prime, the galaxy looked completely different than it had before the Liberation War began. President Ryan Clark stood in the rebuilt United Nations building on Mars as representatives from 37 different species gathered to sign the Galactic Liberation Charter. The document would create the first government in galactic history that was based on freedom and cooperation instead of conquest and slavery. The former Zephyrian Empire had been transformed into the Galactic Federation, where every species had an equal voice in making decisions that affected them all. The Charter guaranteed basic rights for all intelligent beings, including the right to live free from slavery, the right to govern their own worlds, and the right to defend themselves against aggressors. Never again would one species be allowed to dominate others the way the Zephyrians had done. The Zephyrians themselves had been stripped of their military power and confined to a single world under strict supervision by Federation peacekeepers. Many of their former subjects had wanted to execute the entire alien leadership for their crimes, but humanity had argued for mercy instead of revenge. The defeated aliens would have to rebuild their society without weapons or the ability to conquer. Other worlds. Admiral Lisa Kane had been promoted to Supreme Fleet Commander, and now oversaw the integration of dozens of different ship designs into the new Federation Navy. The fleet that had once consisted of desperate human refugees hiding in asteroid belts was now the largest and most advanced naval force the galaxy had ever seen. Ships from every member species worked together to patrol trade routes and protect weaker worlds from pirates and raiders. Earth was slowly being rebuilt, but it would take centuries to restore what the Zephyrians had destroyed. Teams of scientists from every Federation world were working together to cool the planet's surface and rebuild its atmosphere. New Geneva, on the former Zephyrian world of Kepler Prime, had become the temporary capital of human space, while their original home slowly healed from its wounds. Dr. Betty June had established the Interspecies Technology Institute on Zephyr Prime itself, where scientists from every member species worked together to push the boundaries of knowledge. Their first major project was developing the technology needed to restore Earth's biosphere in decades instead of centuries. The irony was not lost on anyone that the former capital of galactic oppression had become the center of cooperative scientific research. The freed slave species had thrown themselves into rebuilding their worlds and cultures with enthusiasm that amazed their human allies. The Gekonians had restored their ancient cities and were teaching their children the history that the Zephyrians had tried to erase. The Hydronians were expanding their ocean cities and developing new technologies for underwater civilization. Dozens of other species were rediscovering traditions and knowledge that had been suppressed for generations. Jake Morrison had been promoted to admiral and now commanded the Federation's deep space exploration fleet. His job was to search for other species that might need help or protection from aggressive neighbors. The galaxy was vast, and there were probably thousands of civilizations that humanity and their allies had never encountered. Some of them might be peaceful, but others could be as dangerous as the Zephyrians had been. The Liberation War had cost millions of lives and left entire worlds in ruins, but it had also proven that cooperation was stronger than conquest. The Federation fleet was more powerful than the old Zephyrian Empire had ever been because it was built on willing alliance instead of forced submission. Free people fought harder and worked smarter than slaves who were driven by fear and pain. General Marcus Cole had retired from active duty, but he still served as an advisor to the Federation government on military matters. He spent most of his time writing the official history of the Liberation War so that future generations would remember the price of freedom. The book would include the stories of every hero who had died fighting against oppression, including Alex Stone, who had sacrificed himself to save the galaxy on the anniversary of Earth's destruction. A ceremony was held in the ruins of New York, where Katie Bell had made her final transmission. A monument was unveiled bearing the names of all 8 billion humans who had died when the Zephyrians turned their home world into a ball of fire. At the base of the memorial, her last words were carved in letters that would last forever. Remember us. Make them pay. Below Katie's message, the survivors had added their own words that told the rest of the story. We remembered, we made them pay, we made them free. The monument stood as a reminder that humanity had not only survived genocide but had transformed their tragedy into triumph for the entire galaxy. They had kept their promise to their dead and had built something better from the ashes of their loss. Dr. Nina Foster continued her research into the psychology of oppression and freedom, studying how societies recovered from slavery and conquest. Her work helped the liberated species deal with the mental scars left by generations of Zephyrian rule. She also developed early warning systems that could detect when a civilization was becoming too aggressive and might threaten its neighbors. The Federation had established colonies on 100 worlds that had once been Zephyrian prison planets or military bases. These new settlements were designed as models of interspecies cooperation where humans, Geconians, Hydronians, and other aliens lived and worked together as equals. The colonies were proving that different species could share the same world without conflict if they respected each other's rights and cultures. Trade between Federation worlds was booming as each species contributed their unique skills and resources to the common good. Geconian crystal technology was used to build better computers while hydronic bioengineering helped develop new medicines. Human ingenuity and determination had sparked innovations that benefited everyone in the alliance. President Clark looked out the window of his office at the lights of New Geneva stretching toward the horizon. The city had been built by refugees who had lost everything but had refused to give up hope. Now it was the capital of a galactic government that represented the dreams of billions of people who had once lived in fear. The transformation seemed impossible, but it had happened because ordinary people had decided to do extraordinary things. The age of human expansion into the stars had begun, but this time humanity would not be going alone. They had learned that the galaxy was full of friends waiting to be discovered and enemies that could only be defeated by working together. The species that had lost their homeworld had become the liberators of the galaxy and the guardians of freedom for all intelligent life. As the ceremony ended, and the delegates returned to their ships, Clark smiled at the stars visible through the dome above the city. Somewhere out there, other species might be suffering under the rule of new tyrants who thought themselves invincible. But they would learn what the Zephyrians had learned too late, that free people united in common cause were the most powerful force in the universe.